Almighty and everlasting God, who does govern all things in heaven and earth, mercifully hear the supplications of thy people, and grant us, thy people, all the days of our life, peace and quietness. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We turn to Dr. Mason's Thomas Cranmer, page 12. And apparently Henry VIII, with this great burden of conscience, is living rather extravagantly and ostentatiously, with Anne Boleyn at his side, almost as if she was the queen. If only Rome could have adopted a firm attitude at this juncture, although it was too late to retrieve the mistake of Julius. Yet England might at least have been lost with dignity. But the poor bastard who held the see of Rome was incapable of taking a firm attitude of principle. Clement VII at one moment assented to the institution of a collusive suit before Wolsey as legate, in which, without Catherine's knowledge, Henry was summoned to answer on a charge of living with his brother's wife. At another moment, he promised to give Henry a dispensation to marry a new wife, without deciding for or against the validity of the first marriage. These were the weapons of unscrupulous weakness. At length, a commission was issued to Wolsey and Campeggio to sit as joint commissioners for the hearing of the case. But the duplicity of Clement provided Campeggio with instructions on no account to allow the case to come to a decision. And after many months of obstruction, it was finally revoked in July 1529 to Rome. Things were thus brought to a standstill. The king's disgust at the conclusion of the work of the legates drove him for a day or twain from London to Waltham Abbey. He was attended by two heads of Cambridge houses, Edward Fox, Provost of King's, as almoner, and Stephen Gardner, Master of Trinity Hall, as secretary. These were the two men who had lately managed the king's matter. It was by their exertions that Clement VII had induced to issue his commission for the trial. The harbingers happened to quarter them at Waltham in the house of a gentleman named Cressy. There they met Dr. Cranmer. An outbreak of the plague had driven him from Cambridge, where two of Mr. Cressy's sons were pupils of his. Their mother also being akin to him, the three men were of old acquaintance, and meeting together the first night at supper, had familiar talk concerning the estate of the University of Cambridge. So entering into farther communication, they debated among themselves that great and weighty cause of the king's divorcement. Cranmer modestly said that he had nothing at all studied for the verity of this cause, nor was beaten therein, as Gardner and Fox were. Howbeit I do think, he said, that you go not the next way to work as to bring the matter to a perfect conclusion. This is most certain, that there is but one truth in it, which no man ought or better can discuss than the divines. It had already been recommended that the university should be consulted. Indeed, Cranmer himself had been put on a commission to represent Cambridge in the matter. But Cranmer not only advised that the opinion of learned men of the kingdom should be sought, he advised that the king should then proceed to act upon it without waiting for the frustratory delays of the ecclesiastical courts. When the divine law had been set forth, then his highness, in conscience quieted, may determine with himself that which shall seem good before God, and let these tumultuary processes give place unto a certain truth. Maurice, page 241. If the king rightly understood his own office, neither pope nor any other potentate whatsoever, neither in causes civil nor ecclesiastical, hath anything to do with him or any of his actions within this realm and dominion, but he himself under God hath the supreme government of this land in all causes whatsoever. Even this advice of Cranmer's had no great novelty about it, for Gardiner himself had a year before threatened the Pope face to face at Orvieto that if he did not give sentence as required, England would go over to the opinion that a pope was as unnecessary as he was useless. There were many men of that opinion in England, although it was not much avowed. But Cranmer's utterance came exactly at the right moment for the king, when Fox and Gardiner reported to him their interview with Cranmer. "Marry, saith the king, I will surely speak with him, and therefore let him be set for out of hand. I perceive that the man hath the soul by the right ear." Footnote 3. Cranmer probably never expected his words to be brought to the king's knowledge. Fox, the martyrologist, is most likely right when he affirms that he earnestly entreated to be left to his powerful privacy. If Gardiner could have foreseen the future, he would certainly have done all in his power to give the effect. Got some footnotes here. Bailey's Life of Fisher. The words form no part of the valuable document published, which are served as the basis of Bailey's work, but they are enough in themselves. Brewer, Volume 2, page 252. Fox, Book 8.7. Wordsworth Ecclesiastical Biography quotes the story from Bailey's Life of Fisher in the form, "King swore by his wonted oath, Mother of God, man hath that so by the right ear." So Gardiner would have struggled against this had he known what the future would hold. But things were otherwise ordered. Cranmer came to the king at Greenwich. Henry professed to take him into his confidence. He told him that he never fancied woman better than Catherine, that he only sought for dissolution of his marriage because it was a burden to his conscience. "Therefore, Mr. Doctor," he said, "I pray you, yet nevertheless, because you are subject, I charge and command you, all your other business and affairs set apart, to take some pains to see this my cause furthered according to your device, as much as it may lie in you, so that I may shortly understand whereunto I may trust." Pete, here's one of your papers. Henry had a way of making men believe him. Cranmer, the most guileless and unsuspicious of men, was not slow to be persuaded. He undertook the task and threw himself heart and soul into it. The first duty assigned to him was to cast his opinions on the subject into the form of a treatise. At the king's request, he was received, while writing it, into the house of the Earl of Wiltshire, the father of Anne Boleyn. It has been alleged that Cranmer had been for a long time past a chaplain and friend of the family. The conjecture is based upon a misunderstanding. There is no evidence whatsoever that Cranmer was acquainted with the Boleyns before this date, but he now formed a warm and zealous attachment to them, especially to Anne. Another footnote. Mr. Gardiner's note in Brewer 2.223. I do not know on what grounds Mr. Gardiner admits that Cranmer was ever a chaplain of Wiltshire's. On the other hand, it would appear that Cranmer was already acquainted with Cromwell and had occasionally acted on his behalf. Calendar, State Papers of Henry VIII. So Cranmer and his interest in writing for the divorce became keener as he learned to desire the king's marriage with his hosts. daughter. As soon as the book was written, it was issued to influence the opinion of the Cambridge doctors. Cranmer had, it seems, already disputed on the subject there, and by his skill in argument had converted to the king's side 5 or 6 of those who had been the leading champions of the opposite view. It is probable that now he repaired again, for a time, to Cambridge in furtherance of the cause. His book, at any rate, was widely circulated there and with effect. It is satisfactory, however, to note that he was not personally implicated in the discreditable intrigues by which Gardiner and Fox obtained a majority for the king in the Cambridge Senate House. By the time that the university gave its decision, Cranmer was far away, discussing the matter with more eminent personages than the Cambridge scholars. Footnote 2. Toward the end of 1529, a new embassy was dispatched to the court of Rome. At the head of it, by a strange and audacious selection, was the Earl of Wiltshire, Anne Boleyn's father. Cranmer was a member of this embassy, along with Stokesley, Bishop-elect of London, and others. They found the Pope at Bologna, where the Emperor, Queen Catherine's nephew, also was, and Cranmer probably witnessed there Charles' long-deferred coronation at Clement's hands. Footnote 3. Footnote 1. The occurrence to which Morris refers is evidently the same as that mentioned by the anonymous biographer, who places it before the writing of the book. Both, however, speak of his visiting Cambridge afterwards. Footnote 2. See the account of the Cambridge proceedings in Mullinger 1.618, where the date is given as 1529 instead of 1530. And then the date for this coronation is 24 February 1530. The emperor's presence, no doubt, made the prospects of the mission less hopeful, and Wiltshire failed to obtain Pope's consent to have the cause settled by the Archbishop of Canterbury. When the emperor's back was turned, Clement more than 3 times told the Bishop of Tarbes in secret that he would be glad if marriage between Henry and Anne were already made, either by a dispensation of the English legate or otherwise, provided it were not by his Clement's authority, or diminution of his power as to dispensations and definition of divine law. Footnote 1. Clement had no high-minded determination to see right done by Catherine, but he would not endanger his own position, nor give mortal offense to the emperor. Wiltshire returned to England a few days after Charles had left Bologna, but Cranmer stayed behind and moved with the Pope of Rome. There he went on busily with his negotiations, alternately sanguine and dejected. On July 12, he wrote from Rome to a fellow agent at Bologna. It is the earliest letter of his of which anything is preserved. Quote, "As for our successes here, they be very little, nor dare we to attempt to know any man's mind, because the Pope, nor is he content with what you have done, and he says no friars shall discuss his power. And as for any favor in the court, I look for none, but to have the Pope with all his cardinals against us." We got, this is quoted in a letter from Croke to the king, State Papers of Henry VIII, Volume 4, 6531, which is in part printed by Burnet, Reformation, Volume 1, 155. A little later, the prospect appears to be to him somewhat less gloomy. As concerning the brief, the Pope never granted us none after our device, whatsoever Sir Gregory Cassalis hath written. Marry, this he did well. He willed us to devise a brief, and if it liked him, he would sign it. But when it was devised, faults were found in it, and it was given to the Cardinal Sanctorum Quatuor to amend, but he amended it after a fashion that it was clean marred for our purpose. Since that time we have had so many devised and changed again. Yea, and moreover, when the Pope hath granted some of our devise, the Emperor's oratory hath made such exclamations against the Pope that all hath been changed. I never knew such inconstancy in my life. To show you plainly my thought, I suppose we shall never have none according to our mind, so long as the Cardinal Sanctorum Quatuor, our utter adversary, beareth his authority. Notwithstanding, the Pope is contented, and I trust we shall have one brief, neatly good after mine opinion, but not with such terms as we would have it. Close quote. Footnote 1. Personally, the Pope seems to have made not an unfavorable impression upon Cranmer, to judge from later sayings of him. His Clement's manners were amiable, and he sought to do Cranmer a pleasure. He appointed him to the office of penitentiary, according to some for Henry VIII's dominions, according to others for the whole of the papal communion itself. Whether this was the lucrative position which some have considered it or not, the conferring of it was a high compliment. But in spite of the compliments, Cranmer returned, as Maurice says, not answered, with the Bishop of Rome. We've got 2 footnotes here. He arrived in England in September 1530 to find that the things were past the diplomatic stage and that preparations were making for independent action. In December 1530, the king, under the guidance of the ruthless Cranmer, struck his first blow at the papal power by laying the entire clergy of England under praemunire for having accepted Wolsey as the legate of the Pope, although it had been at Henry's own instance that he was made legate. The convocation, which met at the beginning of the new year, thought it best to make no resistance to this tyrannical measure, but to purchase the king's forgiveness by a large vote of money. Before, however, the gift was accepted, it was determined by the king and his advisers that the church should be forced to acknowledge explicitly its subjection to the crown. Into the deed which conveyed their grant of money, they were required to insert, among other expressions, the clause which acknowledged the king as alone protector and supreme head of the church, as of the clergy of England. The clause was long and vigorously debated in convocation. Messages went backwards and forwards between the clergy and the king. The king was ready to modify his language by admitting the words "after God" into the title of supreme head. Even so, the clergy would not agree to that title. At last, on February 11, Archbishop Warham proposed an amended recognition of the king as sole protector, only and supreme Lord, and as far as the law of Christ allows, supreme head also of the English church and clergy. The amended form was received in silence. When the archbishop reminded the assembly that silence must be taken for consent, a voice replied, "Then are we all silent." The convocation of York followed the example of Canterbury, although some of the bishops of the northern province thought fit to publish protestations explaining the sense in which they admitted to the title, to which protestations the king himself replied in conciliatory manner, declaring that he intended no intrusion into the proper functions of the episcopate. It is to be observed that in all the debates upon the new title, at any rate in this stage of proceedings, no one thought of suggesting that the king was encroaching upon the rights of the Pope. Later on, indeed, it was supposed that by this act the king was substituted for the Pope as the supreme head of the Church of England. And as a matter of fact, if the title was to mean anything at all, it involved the repudiation or restriction of powers which the papacy had been permitted to exercise in England. But the designation of supreme head or sole protector or only and supreme lord of the English Church had never been thought or used of in connection with the Bishop of Rome. And in arrogating it to himself, Henry VIII made no reference to the claims of the papacy, nor did those who opposed the design oppose it in the interests of the papacy. They opposed it in the interests of the liberty of the English Church and in the interests of the spiritual authority assigned to them by Christ to the apostolic ministry, when, mistakenly or not, they were satisfied that Henry was only claiming what his predecessors had always claimed, and had no designs upon the internal constitution of the English Church. The anti-papal drift of the king's new style woke no perceptible alarm. The nation, both in church and in state, was well accustomed to anti-papal enactments, and there were few who objected to them so strongly as to think it worthwhile to speak out. The voice which emphasized the silence of the convocation in Canterbury, when the new title was read out, expressed the feelings of the English Church and the nation. But the next year, 1532, saw the supreme head beginning to interfere with the liberties of the English Church in new ways. In answer to a supplication of the House of Commons, and in spite of temperate and earnest expostulations on the part of the hierarchy, the king forced upon convocation the memorable submission of the clergy. By this they bound themselves not to put forth any new canons or ordinances without the king's assent, and agreed that the existing canons should be examined by a committee of the king's appointment with a view to annulling those which might be found prejudicial to the realm, onerous to the laity, retaining in force the remainder if they should receive the royal authority. The king is said to have exclaimed in the midst of these transactions that owing to the oaths of canonical obedience to Rome taken by bishops at their consecration, the English clergy were but half his subjects. But so far were the English clergy from objecting to the new regulations for fear of causing a breach in the connection with Rome, that the convocation in the same year presented the petition which bore fruit in the Act of Parliament for the abolition of the annates of first fruits, which the bishops had been accustomed to pay to the Roman treasury. The clergy urged in this petition that if the Pope should offer opposition, then for as much as all good Christian men should be more bound to obey God than any man, for as much as St. Paul willeth us to withdraw ourselves from all such as walk inordinately, it should be ordained that the obedience of the king and his people be withdrawn from the see of Rome, for which they allege the precedent of Charles VI of France and Benedict XIII. The Act of Parliament which gave effect to this desire of the clergy was not at once made known. It was the king's wish to make one more effort to bring Clement VII round to his matrimonial projects, and only when that effort failed was the royal assent formally given to the act. In these discussions and determinations, Thomas Cranmer had no share. that we know of, although he appears to have been in England at about the person of the king in the first half of the year, which saw the supreme headship acknowledged by the clergy. In January of that year, although he did not start till later, he was appointed to the difficult post of ambassador to the Emperor Charles V, with a special view to the question of the marriage. He'd recently been made Archdeacon of Taunton, footnote 3. Two of his dispatches from Germany to Henry VIII are extant and reveal in him considerable sagacity and power of observation, footnote 4. He was still engaged in the cause of the king's divorce among the German princes and divines, though with no conspicuous success when he was recalled to England and to the true work of his life. We've got these footnotes. We're just quickly scanning Dixon, Todd, Jenkins, State Papers. On August 23rd, 1532, the liberal-minded Archbishop Warren, the patron of Erasmus, died. It was under him that the clergy accepted the supreme headship and made their submission. It was under him that they had petitioned for separation from Rome in case the Pope should insist upon the payment of the annates. But Warren was still legate of the Apostolic See. Before he died, he wrote a protest against the consequences which might flow from the measures in which he had taken part to the derogation of the rights of Rome or the prerogatives and liberties of the Church of Canterbury. It was too late, however, to protest, and Warham's successor was destined to see and help on the logical results of what had been done under Warham. Most writers treat it as strange and astonishing thing that the king should have selected Thomas Cranmer to succeed in the vacant primacy, as if he'd been an unknown man. Doubtless there were other men who'd occupied a more conspicuous position in the eyes of the English church, but there's no evidence to show that Cranmer's own contemporaries were surprised. An important foreign embassy was the usual step to ecclesiastical promotion. Tunstall, Stokesley, and Bonner successfully passed from such embassies to the great see of London, Gardiner to that of Winchester, Lee to that of York. It was not altogether surprising that one who had been entrusted with missions so important as those to which Cranmer had of late discharged should be put into the See of Canterbury. True, his career up to the year 1529 had been that of a quiet student of the university, but it was not without point that Cranmer himself, when forced, a few years after, to take notice of a foolish slander against his earlier life, replied, "If you had but common reason in your heads, you that have named me an hostler, you might know that the king, having in one hand one of the hardest questions that was moved out of the scriptures these many years, would not send an hostler unto the Bishop of Rome and to the Emperor's council and other princes to answer and dispute in so hard a question." Undoubtedly, it's footnote 1, undoubtedly all open-eyed men must have expected to see Cranmer soon promoted to some high ecclesiastical position, and there's probably some grain of truth in the tale which the papist Harpsfield relates in a distorted form that Archbishop Warham, in a conversation with his nephew, had predicted, not without distress, that Cranmer would be appointed to succeed him, footnote 2. Beyond all question, the person who was most surprised and least pleased by that appointment was Cranmer himself. He cared nothing for honors and dignities, and was probably only anxious to have done with his embassy and to retire into private life again. There was the more reason for his doing so, inasmuch as in the course of his wanderings among the learned men in Germany, it was his chance, footnote 3, again, to marry a kinswoman of one of theirs, Margaret, the niece of the well-known Osiander. Such careless statements are made about matters of this kind that it may be worthwhile to point out how widely Cranmer's marriage differed from that, for instance, of Martin Luther. Martin Luther was a friar, his wife a nun. Both of them believed themselves called by a special vocation to God, to the life of virginity. And here we will call this to an end. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Godspeed.